Much more still ahead here on Good Morning Arizona, now at 8:39. Next, breaking down the preliminary autopsy report on the death of George Floyd and what it can mean. We'll be right back.
There are lots of questions circling the death of George Floyd, the officer who was kneeling on his neck. 44-year-old Derek Chauvin is facing third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter charges this morning. The other three officers, by the way, have not been arrested. Everybody wants to know why. But what was Floyd's cause of death? Today, the attorney for George Floyd's family is set to announce the findings of an independent autopsy. They are rejecting the medical examiner's finding that blamed coronary artery disease and possible intoxicants in his system. So joining us now is Dr. Thompson. She's here to talk about those preliminary results of George Floyd's autopsy, at least the first one, the second one again to come out later. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. We're going to talk about the coronary artery disease and the possible intoxicants. But first, let's talk about what this preliminary report found. And this is a quote: no physical findings that support a diagnosis of asphyxia or strangulation. Could you tell people what that means in layman's terms?
Yeah, I always, when I read something on the internet, I always think of that as the beginning of the information and not the end. So when I see the report says no findings of asphyxia or strangulation, I think immediately that that's referring to blocking off of the airway. Okay. But then I also think about what's missing from that, because the neck contains a lot of important structures, as we all know, that are critical to life. Blood vessels, the airway, and nerves. And damaging any of those can lead to death. And so the preliminary report talks about only one of those: strangulation, blocking the airway. But it doesn't mention damage to nerves or damage to vessels. So that report still leaves a lot unanswered for me in terms of the cause of death.
And obviously for the family as well. I mean, at the end of the day, you had a knee on the neck for, I believe it was upwards of 8 minutes. We obviously don't know the weight of this officer, but I mean, that's a lot to go through, and I don't care what your underlying issues are. But let's talk about what they say they are. Coronary, what was the other cause that they said?
They talked about atherosclerosis and hypertension.
And tell us what that is, how
those
that
are so common. So high blood pressure, blocking of the arteries, and those are common conditions, because at the end of the day, most humans will wind up dying from heart disease, one of those conditions. But those aren't conditions that cause you to fall dead in the street unless you're having signs of a heart attack, which has signs and symptoms. So that brings us to the other point, that the police officers have a duty of care for folks in their custody, because those people can't fend for themselves once they're in police custody. So even if those conditions were showing signs and symptoms of distress, police officers have a duty to seek care immediately for assistance for those things. So this report just leaves me still, and I'm sure the family as well, with lots of questions about why was aid not rendered in a timely way.
There's a lot.
There was 8 minutes that elapsed. Then care should have been sought.
Of course, especially if somebody says they can't breathe. And just on a very basic level, an autopsy report, it's when your body stops, it's a snapshot of how you lost your life. So, you know, rather than, and this is what I'm assuming for what you're saying, so rather than saying what it was not, we want to know what the causes were.
Exactly. And I'm not seeing that in that preliminary report. You've hit the nail on the head. Yes. And also, the preliminary report, it wasn't clear what information they got from his medical history and what they got from actual examination. So those are the details that I want to know. And I think that those details will reveal more. Even the mention of intoxicants, it didn't say that lab results were positive for intoxicants. It said possible. So I'm still questioning what actually is real and what was just a supposition based on history.
Language is kind of funny, Dr. Sharon. This is going to be interesting to see what that other autopsy report says.
Very important.
Thank you for your insight.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is so important for us to talk about.
For sure.